liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November 6th, 2019 edition of Space News. We've got the full team here together. I'm Peter Aylward, and we have Tina Stagg, Michael Abdullah, and Angela DeGrazia with me, and we're all from the Space Association. So let's get started and take it over to the US desk with Angelo.
Thanks, Peter. Let's go straight to US space policy. The US Senate passed an appropriations bill last week that funds NASA, but a final budget deal may still be weeks or months away. The Senate overwhelmingly approved a minibus bill that combined several individual spending bills, including the Commerce, Justice and Science bill that funds NASA. The bill provides $22.75 billion for NASA in fiscal year 2020, with most but not all of the $1.6 billion additional Artemis funding requested by the administration in May. The bill must be reconciled with the House bill passed earlier this year, but a lack of agreements on spending allocations and debates on other issues make it unlikely that it will be accomplished before the current stopgap funding bill for the government expires on November 21st. Okay, to you, Tina.
Thanks, Angelo, and good evening, space fans. In International Space Station news, NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy will fly to the ISS next year. NASA announced last week that Cassidy has been added to the crew of a Soyuz mission next April, remaining there until the end of October 2020. Cassidy, a veteran of one previous long-duration station mission, is taking the place of a Japanese astronaut originally planned for that mission in order for the US to maintain a presence on the ISS given commercial crew delays. Japan had hoped to have astronaut Akihiko Hoshide in orbit next northern summer as the country hosts the Olympics in Tokyo. But NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said limited access to Soyuz seats, along with delays in commercial crew development, will force the agency to delay Hoshide's flight to ensure NASA maintains a presence on the station. Bridenstine reiterated it was highly likely it would buy one or more additional Soyuz seats from Roscosmos, but no deal had been concluded. Turning to NASA's commercial crew program, both Boeing and SpaceX are performing tests of commercial crew abort systems this week. A NASA official said last week that the pad abort test of Boeing's CST-100 Starliner was on track for Monday from White Sands Missile Range. SpaceX will perform a static fire test of the Super Draco abort thrusters on its Crew Dragon spacecraft later this week, which would allow the company to proceed with an in-flight abort test in early December. Both companies could conceivably be ready for crewed test flights early next year, pending those and other tests, as well as certification of other aspects of their vehicles, such as parachutes. Boeing is to broadcast its commercial crew pad abort test this week at NASA's request. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said last week that the test, scheduled for 1 a.m. Tuesday Australian time from White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, would be broadcast. Transparency for the taxpayer, Bridenstine tweeted. Neither Boeing nor NASA had previously disclosed any plans to broadcast the test of the CST-100 Starliner's abort system. All future flight tests in the program by Boeing and SpaceX will also be broadcast by NASA. And it's over to Peter.
Okay, let's look at some more NASA news, this time about Artemis. The initial Artemis lunar lander missions might be limited in the amount of samples they return from the moon. In presentations last week at the Lunar Science Conference, NASA officials said they were already planning the types of science those missions could perform and identifying potential landing sites. However, the ongoing lunar lander procurement requires landers to return only a minimum of 35 kilograms of samples, a total that includes the mass of the sample containers. There may also be some limitations on just how many samples brought up on the lunar landers can be returned to Earth on Orion. One potential workaround would be to return the samples collected by the Artemis crews on a separate robotic sample return spacecraft. Turning to the NASA and planetary science missions, the heat flow probe on NASA's InSight Mars lander suffered a setback last weekend. Images returned from the lander showed that the probe, or mole, was mostly sticking out of the ground instead of burrowing deeper into the surface. The probe had been stuck about 30 centimetres deep for months, but engineers had made progress in recent weeks, getting the mole to move deeper again. NASA said unexpected soil properties were likely causing the problems, and the mission team would develop new approaches to get the mole back on into the ground. NASA confirmed plans recently to send a robotic rover to the moon in late 2022. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said in a speech that the Volatiles Investigating Polar Exploration Rover, or VIPER, would go to the south pole of the moon to study water ice thought to exist on or just below the surface there. VIPER would launch on an enhanced version of a commercial lunar lander and operate for 100 days. NASA had planned to fly a similar mission, Resource Prospector, several years ago, but cancelled it a year and a half ago. And over to Michael for USA Air Force News.
Thanks, Peter. The US Air Force's X-37B spaceplane returned to Earth recently after more than 2 years in orbit. The Air Force said the X-37B Orbital Test Vehicle 5, or OTV-5, mission officially ended with a successful landing on the Shuttle Landing Facility runway at the Kennedy Space Center. The vehicle launched on the 5th mission for the program on a Falcon 9 in September 2017, performing experiments to test technologies in a long-duration space environment. The statement also suggested the vehicle deployed small satellites for the first time. The Air Force expects to launch a 6th X-37B mission from Cape Canaveral in the northern spring on an Atlas V. And turning to Russia. The head of Roscosmos said Russia will build 2 additional Soyuz spacecraft, in part to address potential extended commercial crew delays. Dmitry Rogozin said he instructed Energia to start work on the 2 Soyuz spacecraft, one of which will be used for a space tourist flight in 2021 and the other for ISS crew rotations. Rogozin said he received a warm letter from NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine about NASA's desire to purchase additional Soyuz seats in 2020 and 2021 because of the possibility of additional delays by Boeing and SpaceX in commercial crew development. He said that would require Russia to reduce the number of Russian cosmonauts on those missions.
And in Japanese news, Japan's Hayabusa 2 spacecraft has wrapped up its work at the asteroid Ryugu and is ready to return home. The last major task for the spacecraft was the deployment last month of Minerva 2, a small rover designed to land and travel across the surface of the asteroid. But the rover suffered problems with its control system, and instead scientists tracked its descent to measure the asteroid's gravitational field. Hayabusa 2 will depart Ryugu in November or December, returning asteroid samples it collected to Earth. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is considering upgrades of its H3 rocket for lunar missions. A company official said last week that upgrades of the H3's upper stage could allow it to send an HTVX cargo spacecraft to the Lunar Gateway using 2 launches, one to place the HTVX in orbit and the other an upper stage with an enlarged fuel tank to dock with the cargo spacecraft and boost it to the moon. A later upgrade to the H3 with a triple-core design like the Falcon Heavy could send a cargo spacecraft to the moon on a single mission. Back to Angelo.
Okay, thanks Tina, and we'll go to SpaceX news. The first prototype for SpaceX's next generation launch vehicle, or part of it at least, has rolled out to its launch pad last week. The lower half of the Starship Mark 1 prototype was moved down the road from its assembly site at Boca Chica, Texas, to the launch pad. It will be joined at the pad later by the upper half of the vehicle and prepared for a test flight to an altitude of 20 kilometres. SpaceX's CEO, Elon Musk, said at the event there a month ago that the flight would take place in 1 or 2 months. I think it's probably running a little bit later than that, but nevertheless, by Christmas we should see something pretty exciting. Moving over to Virgin Galactic news. Virgin Galactic has begun trading as a public company on the New York Stock Exchange. Virgin is a public company after closing its merger with social capital Hidu Sophia, a special purpose acquisition company that traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Company CEO George Whitesides said the merger, which provides Virgin with more than $450 million of capital, supercharged the company to achieve its goals of commercial human spaceflight. The company will remain focused on long-term ambitions, including the potential for high-speed point-to-point travel in cooperation with Boeing. I believe early news is that the stock price has actually dropped a little bit, but time will tell whether people are really interested in this. So, interesting turn of events. Moving across to SAA, which is Suborbital Autonomous Rocket with Guidance. A reusable suborbital rocket malfunctioned and crashed shortly after liftoff last week. Exos Aerospace's SAA, reusable sounding rocket, appeared to suffer an altitude control problem seconds after liftoff from Spaceport America. The rocket crashed near the launch site 3.5 minutes later after reaching a reported peak altitude of about 12.6 kilometres, far short of the planned altitude of 80 kilometres. The launch was the fourth for this rocket, and while previous flights also suffered attitude control issues, none were quite as severe as this one. Okay, back to Michael.
Thank you, Angelo, and let's turn to Firefly Aerospace. Firefly Aerospace will work with Aerojet Rocketdyne in an agreement that could lead to use of an Aerojet engine. Aerojet Rocketdyne and Firefly will collaborate on multiple fronts, including the orbital transfer vehicle that Firefly is building to ferry low Earth orbit satellites up to the geosynchronous transfer orbit. While Firefly is developing its own engines for its Alpha small launch vehicle, with the first flight scheduled for early next year, the company said it's considering Aerojet's AR-1 engine, originally developed for potential use on ULA's Vulcan rocket, for its larger Beta rocket. Firefly is considering using Aerojet's AR-1 in the Beta rocket so the vehicle can place up to 8 metric tons into orbit, a size it considers the sweet spot in the medium-class launch market. Firefly Aerospace's agreement to work with Aerojet Rocketdyne goes beyond the potential use of the AR-1. Firefly says it's taking advantage of Aerojet's expertise in additive manufacturing to produce components for the Reaver engines it is developing for its Alpha rocket. Qualification tests of the Alpha first stage with 4 Reaver engines are planned for the middle of this month, with a first launch planned for early next year. And Angelo, back to you.
Stratolaunch. Stratolaunch has a new but unidentified owner as it seeks to press ahead with development of an air-launched system. In a recent statement, the company said it had transitioned ownership after being owned since its founding in 2011 by Vulcan, the holding company of the late Paul Allen. But Stratolaunch declined to identify the new owner or the value of the transaction. The company's future has been in question since Alan's death a year ago, and the company has made no public statements since the first and, to date, only test flight of its giant aircraft 6 months ago. Okay, to Peter.
All right, and finally this week, astronomers believe a main belt asteroid could be the smallest dwarf planet in the solar system. New observations of the asteroid Hygeia by the European Southern Observatory show that the object appears spherical, suggesting it is large enough that self-gravity could shape it into a sphere. That would qualify it to be designated as a dwarf planet under the International Astronomical Union's definitions of such worlds, joining worlds like Pluto and Ceres. With a diameter of just 430 kilometres, it would be by far the smallest known dwarf planet. And that's it for Space News. Thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye now.